Hello and welcome to CivilNet. I'm here with Geram Moukhnetian. He's a research associate at the USC Institute for Armenian Studies. He moved with his family from Armenia to the United States when he was 14 years old. We're going to talk about what the transition was like and how he navigated his identity as an Armenian-American. Hi Geram, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Hi.
So you were born in Gyumri, Armenia's second largest city, in 1991, the year of Armenian independence, and you moved with your family when you were 14 years old. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the circumstances that forced your family to come to the United States and what the transition was like.
Yes, as you said, I was born in the year of the independence. As we used to like to say, I'm 5 months older than Armenia. So we lived in Gyumri, which throughout the 90s was very difficult place to be in. It was struggling to recover post-earthquake, post-independent shock, the economic shock. There was no work in the city. And my family tried to survive in that environment all throughout the 90s. Throughout the worst years, there was no heating, there was no electricity, there was no running water. People lived in these shacks, as they are called in Gyumri, domiks. And we lived through that throughout the 90s and on first 5 years of the 2000s. But eventually the economic stagnation grew to a point where it became impossible for my own parents to see any way of guaranteeing a prosperous future for their own kids. So they made that difficult decision to relocate from Armenia in order so that we could have some kind of a chance.
And how did you feel when you first arrived in the United States? And could you talk a little bit more about what that transition was like in the first few years?
So we landed in Los Angeles on January 25th, 2006. And there was a blizzard in Yerevan. We were stuck in Zvartnots for 3 days. We couldn't leave. And so we landed in LAX, wearing this coats and everything, and then we walked out of the airport and it was like 75 degrees outside. And you know, my aunt never was like, oh, it's kind of chilly out here. I'm like, what are you talking about? But it was intense. The transition was intense immediately. And January 25th, we landed here. February 7th, I went to school. So 2 weeks we were here, and then I went to school. And I started 9th grade, second half of 9th grade. If anybody has ever been to a high school in the United States, they know what kind of an environment it is. Everybody has already their friends, their cliques. My English level was that of a 3rd grader. I was sitting in classes with 9th graders. So it was a very difficult transition, but other thing was that there were a lot of students just like me who had recently come from Armenia who were in that transition. So we were in this transition together. You know, and then I went to a high school, which has Glendale High School, which has more than 3,000 students, but half of them are Armenian. So I didn't end up in an environment, of course it was a foreign environment, but not as foreign that would cripple completely. So I did end up in this sort of an Armenian environment. For 3.5 years that I was in high school, at times I would literally end up in classrooms where everybody was Armenian, including the teacher.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a difficult transition, but it was made easier because of everybody around me who was in the same situation.
And what would you say were the biggest shock factors coming to the United States from Armenia?
Well, first of all, I mean, for school-wise, at least, what I realized at the beginning was that the school education level that I had obtained in Armenia as a 9th grader was that of a 12th grader here. So it was much more advanced than what a regular high school student was getting in the United States. So I was sitting in classrooms sometimes a grade or 2 above my own. So, but then the quality of education was, I guess, higher here in sense of the stability and the infrastructure. While in Armenia it was higher in academic-wise, but we know in Armenia we didn't have chemistry labs. We were studying chemistry with books. We were studying informational technology with a textbook because we didn't have computers. Over here you had an abundance of that. And that was a positive shock for me. So that everybody was welcoming. The country was welcoming. You know, you had counselors at school who would sit down and then basically tell you everything you needed to do to plan the next 5 years of your life, which in Armenia was very hard to come by. You were mostly left to your own devices. And here, everything was welcoming. Everywhere you went was welcoming. I don't know if it was because we were in a city where half the population are Armenian, so you end up in an Armenian circle, so that's why it's welcoming. I don't know if it would have been the same if we ended up in rural Texas. I don't know if that would have been, but we had been very fortunate to have that. So.
And how did your identity as an Armenian-American develop and evolve in those high school years? And today, how central is the Republic of Armenia and its domestic issues to your identity and concerns here living in Los Angeles?
I would say very. I have been, I'm a kind of a person who has been involved in everything Armenian here since the beginning. I was in a group called United Armenian Students. Then I was in the Armenian Student Association. I was a president of Armenian Student Association when I was in Berkeley. I was in Armenian Church Youth Organization of the church. Then literally I work in an office with all Armenians as a research associate in Armenian studies. So my whole experience here has been in a way surrounded like a double helix of a DNA with everything Armenian. Connection over there because we have a large family in Armenia, that side. But because of my own line of study and my own interest, which has been more of international affairs, political science, Armenia as a state has been very central in my studies. You know, all of my undergraduate study was on Karabakh. So it has been in all the fields that I've been to, very central to it. And I hadn't been to Armenia for 11 years, and this May I got to go back for the first time.
Wow.
So now it has not just become this kind of a study that I was doing for 10 years, but now it has become much more of an actual connection now after all these years. So in a sense, it's been a very strange experience. Me, who has not ever been a kind of a person who has in any way wavered in his identity. Identity was kind of set for me. You know, in Armenia, you don't have a problem of identity. You don't go to an Armenian school, all schools are Armenian. You don't, everybody around you is Armenian. So as a sense of an Armenian identity, I feel like you much more discover when you are not in Armenia.
Right.
When you actually have to focus on it, when you actually have to make an effort to keep in touch with it. In Armenia, it's just granted to you. So here, much more of a struggle or of understanding has been to incorporate my new American identity into this, because obviously I am no longer just Armenian, I'm also an American, and that has to come into this. So there has been that kind of the battle and then understanding between the two.
And September 21st is the 26th anniversary of Armenia's independence as a sovereign state. And this day is an opportunity for us to reflect on Armenia's achievements as a country and also the work that still has to be done. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what are those strong points and then also our weaknesses?
Definitely. A lot of people, when thinking about it, would say that, oh my God, we have been independent for 26 years. We haven't achieved much. We could have done so much that we haven't. But if you look at it, I'm a 26-year-old. If I look at my own experience in my own life, I barely have my life together. And how can I have that expectation of a state, not just one person, but a state of 3 million people, a state which is in perpetual state of war, which is still trying to recover from a shock therapy of literally changing its entire economy? How can I have those expectations from a state where literally everyone struggled in the same level as I did? You know, and then in that sense, it would have been an unrealistic expectation, which I'm guilty of sometimes doing so, thinking that it has been this much time and then there are all these shortcomings. But I as a person, I as a 26-year-old on this earth have those shortcomings myself. So it is very real that a state would have them, a very young one. So definitely I know that we have come further, a lot further than anybody other than could do in that situation, any other entity or a state could do in that situation. Definitely there is a far more way to go. Nobody denies that. Nobody who looks into Armenia, who lives there, especially the people who live there, and whoever is a onlooker from abroad cannot deny that there is a major way to go, but everybody has to be realistic.
And what would you say is the greatest challenge right now that Armenia needs to overcome?
For me, as I said, because I had this huge gap of being in Armenia, as I left a 14-year-old and went back a 26-year-old, for me, I think at this point the greatest challenge for it is to overcome this certain way of thinking within people that somehow somebody from outside or from above is the solution to their problems. That is very understandable why that comes from, because for 70 years people lived in a society where everything was planned from above. A regular citizen didn't have a say in the way a country was run or an economy was planned. Everybody was basically a pawn in a game that was planned from the very central government. And people are still in a large way basically stuck in this idea that any kind of a change, any kind of a solution has to be planned and come from above. And for me, I guess the greatest joy would be to see that kind of a thinking overturned. People on the ground level, a regular citizen thinking that he or she could be in any kind of the change they would want to see in their own country, in their own state, in their very young independent democracy. So that would be, I don't know how that would be achievable. I personally think that it's achievable through education. When education is on that level, so that the society would reflect that level. So if it's through education, if it's through involvement by people who do have that mentality, who would do more and by their actions serve as an example, if it is by various programs, if it is national awakening, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, but there is definitely a need for it for the next 25 years of that country.
I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you so much, Gehram, for joining us. And thank you for watching CivilNet.